Hello, and welcome back to Storytime with Uncle Gravy. And we're going to carry on today with a rustle in the grass. Some of you may have seen my Facebook post earlier on with an illustration by the incredible Judith Beryl as to what these little creatures look like. Still in development, but hopefully once this book reaches a little shelf somewhere, there will be more of her incredible pictures in it. So do let me know in the comments what you think of them. That would be great. So big hellos to Isaac and to Theo and to Joseph. Thank you for bearing with me. I know there's been a bit of a pause between chapter 9 and 10, but let's continue. Meanwhile, now the fuss in the garden had died down, Bernie and Chris were coming out of their shell, slowly. They were tired, which meant they didn't have the same energy that they usually had, but they also felt like something very important was missing. And, of course, it was. Russells liked to have a routine, and working together every day was a big and important part of that routine. Without Ash, Bernie and Chris would be facing a lot more work finding food and looking after their end of the garden, but they were also feeling worried about simply not knowing where their friend was. Although they looked very similar, there were big differences between all three Russells, and Bernie was about to be reminded of this. Chris stretched, shuddered a little bit, and then, looking up and away from Bernie, said, "I have been thinking. We should treat this as day one without Ash. Sometimes animals in our garden disappear, and sometimes the giants disappear for a while too. So let's just treat this as normal. Ash may be having an adventure somewhere and could even return to us soon with fantastic stories and exciting news." Bernie thought Chris's voice didn't sound as confident as usual, and wasn't totally sure why Chris was sniffing sometimes and pausing while speaking. This was not how Chris usually talked. However, Bernie's head was still buzzing from the night before and hearing the full moon voice outside of a dream. The voice had sounded so real that it must have been real, but there had only ever been 3 Russells living in their patch of the garden. So who or what could have been making a rhyming voice like Ash and calling out at night? Bernie felt sure now that this awake dream had something to do with Ash vanishing, and inside Bernie's fluffy tummy there was a strange feeling. It felt somehow like Ash wasn't gone forever, but also like Ash wouldn't be back for a long time. As often happened, it felt like Chris knew just about enough and a little bit more on the subject than Bernie to stop a properly big chat happening. There weren't any easy answers for Bernie, but it was also clear that there weren't many easy ones for Chris to find and share either, so there was really only one direction to go. "Okay," said Bernie quietly. "I really hope you are right. You usually are, but this time I really hope you are." Actually accepting that Ash was gone in some way was hard, but once it had been agreed, at least the day could continue, and they could both get along with doing what they would usually do. They parted and crept through the grass, back to the pond for a morning drink and something to eat. While they made their way there, they were totally unaware that their friend, and the reason that their tiny feet were dragging a little bit, was only a few giants' footsteps away. Ash peeked out from under the tatty grey snail shell to see if it was safe to come out, and just like the night before, the land around looked familiar somehow, but was also strange enough to make it feel very important to be as careful as possible. The first thing Ash needed to do was to find something to eat and drink, as the strange and scary night had produced a big hunger. Normally, a trip to the pond and the raspberry canes would offer immediate rewards, but today would require new thinking. Looking up and around, Ash noticed that this garden land also had flappy bird feeders, but many more than Ash was used to. They were all sizes and shapes and colours, and tiny birds were already flitting about and bouncing on and off them. Jake was a very keen bird watcher and often spent pocket money on a new feeder or a different seed mix to attract different birds to the garden, so Ash was about to have a lucky start to the day. After creeping through the grass and over some old red and broken bricks, Ash got close to one of the feeders. On the ground below it, and caught up in grass near to it too, were what looked like mini worms. They were curved, and they stuck out from the grass higher up, where they hung like a kind of strange fruit, ready to be plucked. Ash didn't waste any time, and jumped up to bash a thicker stem of grass, which made one of the strange, dried, wormy things slide down. A little crunch and a nibble on the end confirmed that this actually was a new, tasty and quite meaty treat, and it was not long before the whole thing had been chewed up. A drink, then, was the next thing to organise, but as far as Ash could make out, this garden land didn't have a pond. Not even a dip in the ground that could become a puddle. Sitting down on a small stone, Ash started to wonder where to start looking, as a dry mouth and a full tummy would be a distracting thing without a drink quite soon. Ash may have been unlucky the previous night, but the luck again was about to turn a little bit. From deep within the grass, a gurgling and spluttering noise suddenly started to move its way down from the top of the garden. After a few seconds, there was a sudden eruption and millions of tiny water droplets shot into the sky from two sprinklers at either side of the garden. They made a very beautiful arc of water and mist, which hung for a second and then dropped to the grass and the flowers below. In a short space of time, Ash was casually leaning against a plant stem, mouth open and gulping down fresh and clear water. The first challenge of the day had been completed fairly easily. Now it was time for the bigger ones. Right then, Ash, it's time to plan. You need a place to nap. The food and water might be good, but you must take a nap. I wander here and there to find where new things can be found. Then put it in your head and try to find a friendly sound. Ash was being practical and thinking out loud, and the feeling of making a mental list of things to do was helping a little bit. However, the friendly sounds that were running around inside Ash's house, were imagined voices of Bernie and Chris. Their daily routines may not have always been amazingly exciting or adventurous, but they were what they knew, and they were safe. They were the usual things that a day was built around, and Ash felt that they needed to be put in place, even if the scenery currently looked very different. After a good breakfast and plenty of fresh sprinkler water, Ash had plenty of energy for exploring, so set off, in no particular direction, to see what could be found. Luckily for Ash, Jake's garden also sloped downwards towards the same big fence as Holly's at the bottom of the garden. This meant that Ash's route was guided by the slope, as it was much easier to walk and creep through plants while going down a hill. Ash didn't realise that this was actually happening, but a Russell's legs are very small, so will find their own way naturally. Again, Ash became aware that this new land had a familiar feel to it, but was still different to home. There seemed to be less snail shells around, but as the grass gave way to shorter stems, a very welcome sight appeared. An old plastic bucket was lying on its side, and next to it was a very large pile of clam shells. They looked as though they would tumble off each other at any moment, but as Ash got closer, it was clear that they had once been very sandy, and the sand had now baked hard, almost gluing the shells together. These curvy, fan-shaped scoops offered almost limitless options for a nap, and Ash was very pleased indeed to have found them, without even looking too hard. My word, this day is getting good. I've had some food and drink, and now I've got my own hotel. I'll try some rooms and think. Getting rather sunny now, and I don't want to scrap. I'll choose a place to rest my head and have a morning nap. A brief wriggle later, and Ash was settled down inside one of the shells, head resting on a sandy pillow and dreaming of home. Jake was dreaming now too. He had skillfully managed to avoid all awkward questions from his parents when he went in, and had sidestepped any chat about sightings or animals or anything else by yawning and saying quickly, "Oh, that was cool. We saw what we were looking for too. I'll tell you about it later, but I'm really hungry. What's for breakfast?" After a bowl of cereal and a piece of toast, he had decided that what he really needed was to sleep, a thought which was encouraged by his parents, as he had dangled the last piece of his toast dreamily from his fingers, with his chin propped up on the other hand. Unsurprisingly, Jake's dream was doing what a lot of dreams try to do, by trying to tie off some loose ends in his head and make sense of things. This led him to sleeping with a smile and a look of bewilderment on his face too, as behind his eyelids he was treated to pictures of very tiny, very fluffy creatures drifting across a bright moon, riding on hedgehogs and then disappearing, while beams of light shone into the night sky. Ordinarily, this would have been a very weird but very nice dream to have, but when Jake woke up, he realised, after a few fuzzy seconds, that there were still things that he couldn't understand. Fortunately for Jake, he had something logical that he could do next. Most of the books in Jake's bedroom were spotter's guides, collections of animal stories, and information books about nature. He didn't really have a wild imagination, but still loved to read books that were about things and that he could learn from. He decided that one of the books in his room would have a clue or an idea or even the answer for what Holly thought she had seen, and for what he couldn't believe he had seen during the night. So he picked out a couple about garden animals and mini beasts, flopped back onto his bed and started to turn each page, hoping to see something that could offer some ideas. And you know what that pause means, don't you? It means I've stopped. It means we have to wait until tomorrow to find out what happens next. But something always happens next, because that's how stories work. So thanks for watching today. Drop some comments in about the illustrations, or about anything to do about the story, or if you've got any questions about the characters, and I will happily get back to you. But I hope you're all well, and I look forward to having a chat and telling some more of the story tomorrow. Stay happy.